How's it, everyone? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Is there subtitles on the screen?
There is.
Yes.
That sucks. Let me see. I can take that off quickly. Sorry, guys, I can't seem to figure it out. I hope it's not going to be distracting. But I don't want to waste any more time. So, yeah, I can't see anybody at the moment, but I'll try and man the chat as well. Okay, so maybe you guys can just alert me if I'm not getting to your questions. Okay, cool. So for those who don't know me, I'm Alton, and I'm going to be taking you through task E. So yeah, let's get right into that. Let me not take up more of your time. So I thought I'd start with I don't know if Rendani has done this, and you guys can let me know in the chat. But I thought I'd start with how to unpack the pre-release period. I think Dan has probably touched on that as well. I'm just opening my cell phone so that I can maybe just see the chat on my cell phone because I can't see it on my screen for some reason. I'm still old school, guys, so technology is not my friend. Cool, there we go. Sorry. Okay, cool. So I thought I'd start with how to unpack the required. And some of you who have attended the critical thinking workshop would have heard me talk about the Socratic questioning method. And I'm not going to go into all that detail because we do have workshop videos on that. But for those who haven't seen that Socratic questioning method yet, I thought I'd just spend some time on that now. And obviously apply it to task E of the March 2022 APC. So basically, without going into a lot of detail, Socrates was a Greek philosopher, and basically he used what was coined the Socratic method, but basically he used to ask people a lot of questions when he was in an argument. And then basically that's when the Socratic questioning method was coined, but the idea behind it is that questioning is based on the foundation that thinking has logic, and the premise is really that when you ask questions, your thinking continues, but when you just get answers, your thinking ends, and it's really one of the models that's used for to expand your critical thinking, and it's one of the models that I've done quite a lot of research on. Not going to go through all the benefits, but I just want to touch on like the types of questions, and I'm going to talk about how this could help you in, not just obviously task E, but obviously our focus here is the 2022 December APC. So there's basically 6 types of questions that Socrates came up with, and one of it is clarification questions. So basically when you are in an argument or when you are presented with something, clarification is basically like just getting clarity. So for example, you'll see some examples. Why are you saying that? What does it exactly mean? So you're just trying to clarify what you presented with. The second type is probing assumptions. So like, okay, well, if you are saying this, could we assume this? And you seem to be assuming this. How did you choose those assumptions? This is just some examples of assumptions that we would probe. And then we have a third category of questions that is trying to probe someone's rationale for their arguments, but in the context of the APC, it's usually around the rationale behind making a certain decision. And then it's questioning someone's viewpoint. like whether it's reasonable. For example, you just covered, you know, an NPV calc with Rendani. Is it reasonable that you don't add inflation to your calc? I mean, that's not reasonable at all. And then there's probing the implications. Well, if you're saying this, then what else could happen? So the implication type of questions. And then the last question is questions about the question, which, yeah. So what other questions could you ask? So now some of you are asking like, okay, Alton, for those who weren't in the workshop, like what the heck does this have to do with the APC? And I personally think that, you know, where it can benefit you, especially when it comes to your pre-release, is when you are presented with the pre-release information, is that you are, so you're not going to be in an argument with someone, but you're going to have the text, which is the pre-release information in front of you. And the more you ask appropriate questions of that text, I personally think that you're going to absorb the case study better. But the key thing with Socratic questioning is not questioning for the sake of questioning. It has a goal. And we'll talk about what's the goal of the pre-release and how could you use questioning to help you absorb the case study better. And then also what's the goal of the information on the day and the tasks and how could you apply Socratic questioning to that. Cool. So so if we just quickly talk about the goal of the pre-release, and then I will get to some of your questions. So the goal of the pre-release and how you could use Socratic questioning in the pre-release period is just to absorb the case study for yourself. And this is something that's very critical because you are working in groups, but at the end of the day, you're going to answer that case study for yourself. And what often happens in my experience and you know, consulting with a lot of prior candidates is that you get the pre-release information, you guys quickly decide who does what, and then at the end of the day, you prepare in a sense for your task, but then there's like probably about 7 tasks. There's a risk that there's about 7 tasks that you didn't properly prepare for. You just relied on someone else's research and you kind of throw that into your file and, you know, and then you go and write on the day, which in my mind is like, you are writing from a very, very risky state because like you are relying, there's 7 tasks roughly for which you are relying on someone else's research. And obviously there's not time to do research on all the proposed tasks, but you at least wanted to absorb the pre-release for yourself rather than just, you know, focusing on your task. So that's for me the most important thing about where this could help you to absorb the case study. Then it's obviously to get the crux of what the business is about at a high level. So use, you know, industry analysis, SWOT, etc. Obviously, one of the key things is to spot technical triggers because, as you know, technical triggers are released in the pre-release, and then it also directs further research. And then also you can get possibly start to sense what tasks could be coming. And this is, of course, important because of, identify what task that could be coming, but also be open to the fact that the information on the day could change slightly. So you got to be flexible to the on-the-day changes. And this is especially due to the risk of dumping. Cool. So I'm going to pause it there because I can't see the chat at all or any hands. I just want to know, are there any questions at this point? Are we all together? Is this helpful so far? It's like, Alton, you've shared this already, so why are you sharing it again?
It's helpful, Elton, but I'm just wondering for your slides, can you perhaps share it with us?
In the chat. Okay, cool. I can do that.
Or even if it can be uploaded.
Yeah, I'll definitely upload it afterwards, but maybe I can.
Yes, no, that's fine. Even afterwards, it's okay.
Okay, cool. Cool. I'm going to do it afterwards, definitely. Cool. So yeah, I hope you're finding this helpful. So task E, it's not a big task, but I thought I'd give some this context before we tackle task E. Okay, so let me get back into my slides. Okay. All right. So, okay, so now let's take this, and I want to say this, you know, sort of upfront. This, I'm not saying that this is the way you should be doing things. I'm just trying to offer another perspective to absorb the case study which, you know, if what has been working for you is working for you, then please don't change anything. But if you're saying like, Alton, I can benefit from another perspective to absorb the pre-release and then also possibly how to answer the on the information, then by all means, you can use this alternative way. Education is in the gray. There's no one way of doing things. You got to do what works for you, and hopefully this just offers another perspective. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how I would have tackled task E, the pre-release information. As obviously at this point, you don't know it's task E, you just know it's document 4. So how I would have tackled this pre-release information in order to absorb what is being given to me better and perhaps allow me to do better pre-research. Okay, so we are given a document 4 from Susan, and basically the subject is Africa expansion. So, you know, immediately that I would Africa expansion. I mean, the title already kind of gives you a good idea what it's about. Then that says, as you may have seen in the PowerPoint slides that were shared earlier, they're planning to expand beyond Africa. So I would highlight that. And it's likely that expansion would be through the acquiring of schools, although we would be more willing to partner with local entities to build schools from scratch. And it said it would be irresponsible of us to not enter into partnerships initially, since we are not familiar with the operating environments in other African countries. Okay, so basically we can see that the plan is to expand into Africa, and they're going to try and either do it through the acquiring of schools, although they'll be more than willing to partner with other entities. And basically, if they're going to do that, it's going to be through partnerships initially. And then it says, anyway, I thought I would give you a heads up to you could apply your mind to the strategic initiative and do some research whether the African entities have expanded on the continent. Okay, so clearly saying do some research about other entities. Then they talk about Advotech that has acquired schools in Botswana and Kenya, Kioro in Namibia. And then it says also give some thoughts to the things we need to consider in embarking in our Africa expansion. And then it talks about the fact that they call about the Economic World Forum issues and global competitive, which may provide some insights. Okay, so that's what's given to us. So now I'm going to show you like what I would do in the pre-release to try and just unpack this a bit further. And I would literally take the text and kind of highlight some key things for myself. So you'll see the things that I've underlined. What I'm going to do in the next slide, I'm just turning those into questions, you know, which gets me to think further. So the first thing where they talk about expand beyond South Africa. So I want to say upfront, this is the things that I would have highlighted. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to highlight that as well. And in terms of the questions, also the question that I thought of, and you might think of other questions. So the first thing they talk about expand beyond South Africa. Now I would have paused there because this is, remember, I'm now having an engagement with this text. So is this the first time that Lampras is doing it? Because we're expanding beyond South Africa. So if this is the first time, because if it's the first time, it's very different than if it's not the first time, right? Because there's different context to whether it's the first time or, you know, the second or third time, right? And then also expand beyond South Africa. The question I would also have, is there something unique about expanding beyond SA than versus expanding within SA? Because you don't just have to expand beyond, you can also expand within. So why would you, you know, is there something unique about that? Now, can you see, I'm hoping you can see that just by asking that questions, your mind is already going, or at least my mind is already going. Do you guys see that? Or just get back to the chat here? Or is it like, Alton, this is totally useless? Cool, I see one thumbs up. Okay, cool. So awesome. And the idea is that as you're asking that question, you are going to try and answer it, right? And so in answering that, that's your pre-research. It's being directed, but you are also, you know, being goal-directed in what you are pre-researching. Cool. So let me go back to my second question. So they talk about, you know, acquiring existing schools and then partnering with local entities to build from scratch. So that's two things, right? It's one is, in a sense, an acquisition, and the other one is like it's a partnership, and they're open to both. Now, if you're open to both, the question I would have and it's just a question I would have again, what are the merits and pitfalls of each option? Perhaps I should go and think about the merits and pitfalls of each option. Okay. And then as you go and think about that, you know, your mind can go a bit further, right? Then one word there, they talk about initially, we're going to do this, you know, we might, it would be irresponsible of us not to enter into partnerships initially. Okay, great. So the use of the word initially, words are very powerful, can imply that actually you're willing to do this in the short term, but in the long term, you're actually willing to do something else. And my question then is, so is the long-term plan to build schools without partnering? So you'll partner now, but in the long term, is the plan to build schools without partnering? And then it says, apply your mind to the strategic initiative. So like, why are you telling me this? Can you see it goes back to the Socratic questions, like clarification questions, you know, all this, I'm just bringing it all together. So is it because obviously I need to do some pre-research, but are you telling me apply to the strategic initiative means that I should ignore everything else? So don't worry about the accounting and the tax and the everything else, because like, I want you to apply your mind to the strategic initiative. And that I think is quite helpful because now it narrows you down, because, you know, you could go into Africa expansion, for example, and I think Forex risk is something that sort of everyone will kind of highlight. But then with that, you might go to the nth degree about, I don't know, IFRS and tax around this Forex. And like, you know, you take it to the nth degree, where the fact that we are told to apply our mind to the strategic initiative is actually, in a sense, saying, like, listen, don't worry about all those technical stuff, like focus on the, ignore the non-strategic stuff and just focus on strategic stuff. Then it talks about Advotech Curo and the World Economic Forum. So again, they're highlighting specific reports. So the question I would have, why you're highlighting these? Should my research then ignore everything else? So in other words, if, and I've been marking APC for a while, guys. So I remember one year there was research done by, I think, some Mazars office or some UK office, and that all the candidates had like those, I don't know, 300 odd pages of reports in their files. And obviously on the day, like you cannot prepare all those things. And then on the day, you're going to be asked a specific task, right? And so, I mean, something like this, the pre-release is highlighting specific reports. If you're going to have like 10 or other reports outside of these three, you're probably just adding for the sake of adding. That other report is not going to be useful. So in a sense, this is trying to say, listen, focus on these three. Maybe you can add one or other two for clarity, but these three should be your focus. And then it says, consider in embarking. And this is quite a powerful thing, because if you know from math, you know, when management accounting and finance is all about decision making and problem solving. So when we focus on decisions, we cannot, or it would not be wise to make a decision purely based on numbers, right? There needs to be qualitative considerations. So when we embark on anything, that's a decision that we need to consider. And when we consider that decision, it's, you know, it's a lot of it is qualitative considerations. And they are actually in your math toolbox or your CTA studies, a lot of strategic tools available that you can use before you, if you're going to embark on a decision, a strategic decision, which again is kind of like triggering a technical tool that could, you know, just that you could refresh in your pre-research period in order to help with this task. Okay, cool. I'm going to go back to the chat again. Is there anything I've missed in the chat? Any hands? Sorry, everyone. I'll take this slide by slide. Jorindo saying the London pack. Yeah, the famous London pack. Cool. So if there's no questions or hands, I'm going to just move further. Okay, so let's just recap where we're at. Again, this is a tool, an alternative tool that you may or may not find useful in helping you to absorb. For me, the most important thing is I want each and every one of you to absorb the case study for yourself. You may not be the one that goes and does the in-depth pre-research of everything, obviously, but the actual case study, that 15, 16 pages of the pre-release, like everyone needs to absorb it for themselves. And I'm hoping that this pre-release, this Socratic questioning is, if you haven't been doing that, I hope it will be a useful way of doing that. Okay, then of course, as much as you can, like I've done, pretty much highlight some key words in the text and then question those words. As much as I need to do that, the other big thing that is important is to obviously pick up any technical trigger that the pre-release is triggering, okay? Because as you know, a technical task must be triggered. And so it's vitally important that you pick up that trigger, because if you don't and you get a technical question on the day, you are going to be lost. Okay, so I think in terms of this task, it was quite clear in terms of, if you can call it the technical competency area, it was quite clear that it was strategy and risk management. I think everyone is comfortable with that. Like, no one thought it was hectic tax, hectic accounting, or hectic auditing. Was there anyone that thought that? Are we all comfortable that it's pretty much strategy? Oh, I don't see any. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. So let me get back to, so in this slide over here, I've just sort of highlighted the triggers. I think this task had quite clear triggers. I mean, it was quite clear. You had to research the African environment. You had to, there were things you needed to consider before embarking on this journey. There was a link to World Economic Forum. I left it out on the slide, but there was also the looking at what Curo has done, looking at what Advitech has done, and in terms of a technical competency area, it was, SRMG, right? And then I said the other goal of the pre-release period is to, and it's not the major goal. I think the major goal is absorbing the case study and making sure you pick up the triggers. And then, maybe the last goal is to kind of get a sense of what tasks you can expect, but do not be too married to that, because, the information on the day could change, and then you might run the risk of dumping, as I said. But at the moment, based on what we've given, it looks like it's probably going to be something about commenting on the strategic initiative of expanding into Africa and providing key considerations around the expansion. Okay, so in this pre-release period, I mean, there was this, all those questions that I had, and part of what you would try and do is to try and answer those questions, because you don't know what's going to be asked. You might have a sense, but you don't know what's going to be asked. So is to try and answer the question. That's one part of it. The second part of it is obviously to make sure that you've picked up the technical competency area. And once you've picked up those technical competency area, this is the point at which you need to be asking yourself, do I need to go and revisit my CTA ITC knowledge in this competency area? Okay, because that knowledge, and it doesn't have to, we're not going to ask you an ITC type question that tests, something that's technically difficult, like a super technically difficult deferred tax task. I don't think will come in the ITC, but the basics around deferred tax, for example, or the basics around the MPV may come up, and you need to refresh that knowledge, because on the day it will be, you'll apply those basics to a given task. And it's the same in this task. It was quite clear that SRMG was triggered, and at a minimum, you would have needed to refresh your memory on the basic strategic tools that could help with making a decision. And in this regard, I just want to highlight a few, one of which some of you have heard me say before. And if you haven't heard before, I think one of which is vitally important, because I almost think I haven't seen the APC December 2022 APC at all, obviously. But based on my experience, there's most likely going to be a task where you at the minimum have to mention some qualitative considerations. And this first tool that I'm going to talk about is, I almost want to say it's my default. Whenever there's someone asks me what other considerations should there be, on top of an NPV, on top of a valuation, whatever the case may be, I'm going to apply what we call here the SASF model. Okay, so firstly, the SASF model. It's a model that was designed by Gary Johnson and Kevin Scholes, and basically it's a model for strategic decision making, which is basically saying, well, you have this decision at hand that you haven't that you haven't gone ahead with it yet. You are still deciding on whether you're going to go ahead with it. So it's again that, remember, go back to this, consider in embarking. You see that the text said consider in embarking. So what are the things that, irrespective of a task, of the specifics of a task, this tool over here helps you to unpack things, when you're considering embarking on a task. Okay, so the SASF model, I'm going to talk you through it now. The first, it's an acronym. So the S stands for, is this decision suitable? So in this context, it would be, is the decision to expand into Africa suitable? And that question you would answer in light of the company's strategy, their mission, their values, their strategic position, etc. Okay, so is this decision to expand into Africa, is it suitable in light of our strategy? Okay, and in your pre-research period, if you can answer that question, and there's some 3 strategic tools you can draw on, okay, if you can answer that question, of course, on the day, if they ask a task like that, you've already thought about that, right? The second thing is the A, which stands for, is the decision acceptable? And when we think of acceptable, it's in light of the risk. So expanding into Africa, we got to recognize that, not saying that the rest of Africa is more risky than South Africa necessarily. I'm not trying to make that claim, but at the minimum, it is outside of the norm because we operate in South Africa. So we got to recognize that there is some level of risk. Okay, so is the decision acceptable in light of the risk we're going to take on? Is it acceptable in light of the return that, we need to do some sort of return analysis? And are we taking into account all stakeholders? So it's one thing that it might be a positive NPV and the shareholders will be happy, but will the employees be happy? Will the community that we're going to go in, let's say like a mining project, we're going to break down this community to build this mine. Is that, is that acceptable to that community? So in any decision, we got a strategic decision, we got to focus on, at least think about broader stakeholders. And then in terms of the feasibility, do we have the skills or the resources, time to deliver like this Africa expansion? It's a good question. We might not have this necessarily all the skills initially, so maybe partnerships will be better. So feasibility is skills, resources, time to be able to deliver on this decision. And then the last thing, because you are in the APC and ethics is vitally important, is just always be alert to the fact that, is this decision I'm making, is it ethical? And that's not just professional ethics like CPC or, Companies Act, but also just like morally, like, is this, does this present you with some sort of ethical dilemma that you don't feel comfortable with? Cool, so that's the SASF model. Like, I want to say there's a 90% chance that if you apply the SASF model, you'll be able to come up with a lot of things to say in this coming APC, because there's a 90% chance that there will be some sort of question around qualitative considerations. Okay, then I just want to briefly talk about the Porters, Fire Forces, and SWAT. You guys should know, or you should be able to find material on that. But I think in the context of this task, I just wanted to highlight that Porters, Fire Forces, and SWAT are kind of like more micro considerations, in the sense that micro meaning that if you have I wish I could draw now, but you have the company, then bigger than the company is the industry, and then bigger than the industry is basically the whole country, which is macro, right? And so Porters, Fire Forces, and SWAT is more focused on the company and the industry, so it's smaller, whereas Pestle is focused on macro, which is bigger. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that they all have an impact on the company, because a company is going to be in a specific country, right? So they're going to be impacted by the macro things of that country. And it's an education industry, so that industry will have its specific industry factors, which is where Porters helps. And then SWAT is kind of a crossover between a lot of models. All right, I'm going to pause there for now. Is there any questions? I've spoken a lot without checking any questions. Sorry, guys. I don't know if I'm talking a lot of nonsense or overwhelming you, but I hope you're finding it useful so far. You're still good. Awesome. Cool. Thanks, guys. It feels like I'm going so fast. It's a pleasure. The SAFE model, yeah. So SAF is, well, obviously coined by Kevin and Scholes, but SAFE is kind of the E that I've added. So maybe if I have money, I can patent it one day. Cool, awesome. So let us continue. So where were we? So we were, you know, kind of unpacking the pre-release and drawing out what we need to draw out. And so, you know, the Socratic questioning, the making sure that you identify the technical trigger. The specific technical trigger here was SRMG. And if it was me, in my pre-release period, the SRMG tools that I would have been on top, tried to be on top on is SAF or SAFE, and then Porter's 5 SWOT and Pestle. Cool. So now let's look at what happens on the day. Okay, so on the day, Susan comes around again and she basically says, with reference with my email dated 25th of March, they would like to adopt a more structured approach. They're concerned if we do not have a proper plan, okay, we may pursue opportunities that appeal to us rather than more appropriate opportunities. Okay, and then it says, remember that Lampros has never acquired another business in its history, so this is new territory for us. Okay, so I mean, if we just think of the pre-research, or one of my questions that I had is this the first time Lampros is going into Africa? I mean, not only is it the first time they're going into Africa, it's the first time they're actually might potentially take over a business. Then it says the board has requested that we start a checklist. So now we need to be on alert, because now it's getting into what you actually need to do. It says the board has requested that we start a checklist that we could use to identify which African countries would be suitable for investment. Okay, so I want to pause there for a moment, okay, without going into any detail. If we pause at that sentence, right, are we, in a sense, going here into more the macro things or the micro things? Or both? It says, checklist we could use like which African countries would be suitable for investment. Is it micro or macro or both? Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Jerindo, all yes, great. Okay, so clearly you can see country level. If we again remind ourselves, we have South Africa, we have the education industry in South Africa, and then we have University of the Western Cape. I know I'm biased. So yeah, so definitely the country factors is definitely more macro. Cool. So, and that I think at the end, that was one of the key things actually to pick up from this question, is that the focus here is macro. Okay, so they would like a checklist of say 8 factors. Okay, so now it's giving us a number of say 8 factors. And then they're kind of saying an obvious factors, you know, whether English is widely spoken. And then it says draft a checklist for my review, list the key factors that should be considered with a brief explanation of why each factor is relevant. Ultimately, we want to require a list of attributes of individual investment opportunities. So that's micro, right? Individual investment. Should we invest in the University of, schools now? Should we invest in, you know, a school in Lusaka, right? A specific school in Lusaka. That's an individual investment. That's a micro decision, okay? But it says for now, let's focus on a country level. So, you know, it's a focus on a macro level. Okay, so this summarizes what was asked: drafting a checklist with key factors that should be considered when evaluating suitable countries, a brief explanation of what each factor of why each factor is relevant, and then a focus on country level. That was in the IOD. And then the task list is drafting a checklist with a minimum of 8 factors, and then a brief explanation to be provided for each factor. All right, now, yeah, just on the expected preparation, we've already gone through this: African environment, the World Economic Forum, South African entities that have entered the continent, and then considerations prior to entering Africa, which basically would have stemmed from if you applied the SASF model, you would have thought about some considerations before expanding into Africa. So in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of, I didn't mark the exam, but I think in the opinion of the examiners, there wasn't a lot of surprises in terms of the task itself. I mean, the task was quite clear, except of course, sorry, this should have been my bad, because on macro factors. So I think the only surprise, if you can call it that, is that the task on the day focused you on macro factors and not micro factors. Do you guys agree with that, or do you think I'm not being fair in my opinion that there was not really much any surprises from the pre-release to the IOD? You guys agree? Okay, I see no disagreements. So I'm going to take it as you agree. I know it's also the graveyard shift. So cool. Thanks, Desmond. Thanks, Des. Okay.
Hi,
Cool.
Edson.
Hi, Gracious.
Yes, I wanted to ask just on that question where you're saying that the fact that the information of the day was focused on the country. So I'm thinking from the PRI, right?
Yeah.
Was the point of us reading the World Economic Forum not sort of like giving a direction of country issues? I don't know, because, yeah, was the fact that we have to go and look at World Economic Forum issues, wasn't that an indication to say they might be pointing us to country issues? Because when you look at that report, it's sort of like look at a country level. So yeah, that is my question. Wasn't that an indication in the pre-release?
No, I mean, you're absolutely spot on. I think the danger with the pre-release is that you got to be careful to go too narrow too soon, right? So because on the day they could very well have given you a specific school that you needed to, should we invest in the school, which would have been more micro. But I think what this pre-release is highlighting is that there's the need to think about macro and micro, and then on the day it's now a focus on on macro factors. So I do agree with you. The World Economic Forum is starting to lean towards more macro factors, but I would just caution to kind of look for keywords in a pre-release that focuses you too early, if that makes sense. Because
Okay.
yeah, because I'm just scared like you adopt that and then in the APC it's actually something else happens, right? So I do think that this pre-release was broad in the sense that it was scope for micro and macro. For example, looking at what Advotech has done and what Cura has done might have lent you to more like micro factors, because they obviously have invested in specific schools in those countries. So so I think that's the skill of the pre-release, is to be more broad. And that's why I, for example, have these questions to allow me to like just question everything, which allows me to be broad but also in a sense focused. But to focusing too soon, I'm just scared that you might just, like, for example, if you focus just on the World Economic Forum report, you would have lost the richness from the other reports. And what if the question on the day was more focused on the richness of those reports, then you would have been a bit lost on the day. Does that make sense?
Yes, noted, thanks.
Cool. But thanks for that question. Cool. So the question here, I see a hand and I see some questions. Nobushle, you can go ahead.
Hi. Thanks. I think I think what that I want to ask is what is researching on what Curo Advotech has done gonna help me? Like I'm not sure if, let's say, I can read up and see that they have expanded in Africa, does it mean maybe there is an opportunity for us to also expand there, or does it mean there's already competition out there? Maybe I should look for other countries that they have not considered investing in. Like, I didn't understand how researching that part is going to help me.
I mean, that's a very good question. So I hear you saying the one side is, well, if they've already expanded there, then maybe we shouldn't go into those countries because there's already competition. So I think that's a good, and I mean, that's something that you could have researched, and that, remember, we don't know what's coming on the day, right? So that may have been a consideration on the day. But another reflection is, well, maybe we can learn from what they looked at when they embarked on acquired those schools. And I think that's more the angle where this task was going to say, well, if Kyoto invested in schools in Namibia, for example, is there something that we can learn from what they look for? For example, do they look for acquiring schools that are, or acquiring or starting schools where, you know, the level of income of the population is at least a certain level? You know, that could be one of the things that they consider. Is there enough qualified teachers? All of, so maybe those things are something that, and we can learn from that. So that's the one side, and the other side is, well, okay, we can learn from that, but then let's not go into schools into countries or cities where they are already, because we don't want that competition. Does that make sense? So yeah, so I'm not discounting what you're saying. I think what you're saying is useful. It obviously just didn't play out in this task, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. Cool. Then there was a few questions like, how do we go about reading the World Economic Forum report for our research purposes? It's a very, very good question. And I don't want to take the time up with now going into the detail of the actual World Economic Forum report that, you know, you could have read for the specific case study, but I want to talk about reports generally. So generally, reports, especially like, you know, the World Economic Forum is quite a key report, right? That, you know, is publicly made available. There would always at least be an executive summary of those reports. So I would start with reading the executive summary of any report that that you think may help with your pre-research. So that's where I would start, because you're not going to read what's it, 200 pages. So the executive summary will help. And then like depending on what type of report it is. So the World Economic Forum is not obviously just focused on education, but education is one of the economic issues. So in this case, if I had to read that report, I would focus on where they talk about, you know, in a sense, education specifically in context. And again, there, I would also just look out for where is there a summary of that versus reading all the detail. I don't know if that helps, Dion, Hendrina, and Granton. So yeah, it is a large report. And, you know, it speaks to, because all reports is, in a sense, a report back on research. And whenever someone writes a research report, there has to be some sort of intro, and, you know, in academic research at the university, there has to be a sort of an abstract, which is an executive summary. I'm saying a summary was not easily available. Okay, I was not aware that summary was not available. But there should be some, like, for example, let's take a annual report of a company. That's also 200 pages, right? But there is, the CEO is as a report, and from his report alone, you get a lot of meat about the company. So maybe the World Economic Forum report is, it's not a good example, but there should be some sort of abbreviated way of getting the crux out of a report. But I mean, I'm happy to, you know, take it outside of this forum and to, you know, just, I'll go and look at that report again and to give you some handles on how you could have, you know, read it a bit easier. Cool. Any other questions? What's an I? I see your hand.
Yeah, hi, Elton.
Hi there.
I wanted to confirm, in the IOD, it mentions that there's a part where it said we could use to identify which African countries would be suitable for the investment. So in terms of my response, or in terms of the pre-release, when I'm doing my research, do I have to specify the country, or I look at it from an overall perspective to say, let's say in Africa, or let's say outside South Africa, right? We have various countries. Or do I then have to go into detail to say I'm specifying, let's say Namibia, like I think Namibia would be proper for you to invest based on those factors, or I don't have to specify a country, but I'm just looking at it from an overall perspective.
So I just want to, in the pre-release, you saying that they said, sorry, which point in the pre-release was it?
So this one is directed to the information on the day. In the pre-release, they had mentioned, let's say the countries that they, for Advertech and Cure. So do I then, let's say, focus in saying Namibia, Kenya, Botswana, the ones that have been mentioned, or I go beyond that? Then in terms of my response now, when we say from a country level, do I have to specify a country, or is just an overall perspective of different countries that are outside?
It's a good question. So remember, it's a checklist, right? So it's a checklist that will help you to say, okay, I'm going to run through the checklist, and as I, let's say, tick off the list, hopefully it starts to narrow down which countries match, what I'm looking for. Does that make sense? But it's not you don't have to specifically mention a specific country. It must be, you're coming up with a checklist that you can use to decide on which country you should focus on.
Country you want to then, okay, makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Pleasure. Cool. Any other questions? Andrina saying, would that be the chairman director's report? Yeah, Andrina, yeah, I think if the World Economic Forum report had that, it would definitely be that report. We'll give at least a starting point to give you a sense of what's going on. Yeah, and then also, yes.
Sorry.
You can go ahead. No, you can go ahead.
No problem. My question is more, I'd say it's still related, but it's more an exam technique, because in my opinion, these type of questions, they like sweet and short, should not be spending much time. Sometimes you find that you're really struggling to get the main points across with really minimal time. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure if there's any tips, because sometimes they'll be like, they want 4 considerations or 5 or 6, whatever the case is. And it does take time to sort of like plan. And so I'm not sure if that was something you're going to cover later on, but yeah, I think that's sometimes where I fall in the trap.
So, I mean, I wasn't going to cover a specific thing, in terms of time, but I think you're raising a good question. Like, I mean, you should I think we've said this before, you should never be spending more than an hour on a task. My sense is that in this task, if you were, well, your research was appropriate and you understood what was being asked, I think you should finish this task well within an hour, is my sense. So this is definitely not a long task. I don't know if that helps answer your question. In terms of preparation, every task, in terms of like preparing how to answer, every task more or less will have similar preparation, but the execution of that answering to the task is going to differ. And this task is definitely on the on the lower end of how much time it would have taken you to execute on what was being asked.
Definitely, and I agree with you. I wouldn't want to spend an hour, like 45 minutes. Sometimes that's what I plan on such a task, but definitely agree with you. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that would have been fair. I think it's more that the hour is hey, if I'm spending an hour on any task, but especially this task, there would have been a problem. And I think if you spent an hour on this task, it most likely was because you miss the focus on macro, and you probably try to cover micro and macro, and that obviously that's a misreading or misunderstanding what's being asked, and that's obviously going into dangerous territory. So often the going over time is the misunderstanding of what's being asked. And we'll talk about, just again applying Socratic questioning technique, about there's three key questions that I always say that you just want to think about before you answer a task. Because if you can answer those three questions appropriately, you will, and hear me say this, I'm not saying you will always be a competent grading for a task, but you'll never be a C. Sorry, you'll never be an LC. So, and we're going to go into that now. And I always say it's not the BCs that's going to kill you, it's the LCs that's going to kill you. And what you want to avoid is avoid the LCs at all costs. Just avoid them. Like, it mustn't be on your profile.
Yep.
Cool. We'll talk about that now. I have a hand. Sorry, let me just see. Chirindo, please go ahead.
Hi, Elton. I just want to, I think I put a question on the chart, but you can address that later. I was just asking from when you said you have been marking as well. If I put, say, 10, because they ask like 8 factors, then I'm gambling, then I put 10. Will you guys consider that being incompetent when you just requested 8? Is it a sign that maybe I don't know what is key, or I'm just trying to?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. So we won't mark you down because you've put more than what was required. Where you might lose out on is that what you've put down may not be regarded as key. So often, if someone is dumping more than what's, okay, I'm not saying you are dumping, but if someone is listing more than what's required, one starts to question whether they're actually thinking about what they're listing and just putting down for the sake of putting down. Does that make sense? So it's not that you'll necessarily be penalized because you have 2 more than what we asked. It's just you run the risk that what you have put down, how many of that is actually regarded as, eating the crux of the key factors. Does that make sense?
Yes. Another question is, during my research, I found some countries that I was going to recommend. So this question just requested me to list key factors. Mm-hmm. How would I incorporate that in my responses? I just want to know if I was supposed maybe somehow to say I recommend Botswana because of this and this, and or I was just supposed just to maybe list whatever key factors that we need to look into without recommending any specific country.
So it's a very good question you're asking, right? So were you supposed to list specific countries? No, I don't think you were supposed to list, but now let's just take the context of the task, because I do think there's value in listing specific countries. So it says so it lists the attributes, a checklist we could use to identify which countries would be suitable for investment. So I'm just thinking, I'm Susan, and I give the task, to you. Sorry, I didn't see who was asking the question. Chirindo, yeah. So I'm Susan, right? I give the task to you. You come back and you give me key factors, which are really good. And you come back to me and say, on top of that, I thought about this checklist, and I've actually went further to identify which countries actually is most suitable for investment. In my opinion, if that was well thought through, that's high-level factors that you mentioned. So I would have given you credit as a high-level indicator. Obviously, I don't know how it was marked, but in this context, I would have given you a high-level credit. Does that help to answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. But I just want to say, in this context, it's appropriate. But in other contexts, if you go too much out of what is being asked, it might be unnecessary time. But in this context, I do think listing specific countries, Susan, I would have been happy. Cool. I think there's granted in terms of a checklist. Can you provide guidance on the form and 2-week checklist with questions that directors have to consider, or what should it's a good question. So a checklist could have been a question. It could have just been stated as a statement. I don't think that was this task was prescriptive. I guess a checklist is something that you can just tick, but I guess it's just a list of things to consider. Whether you frame that in questions, I don't think that they would have been too prescriptive with that. And then the lady is asking, what is considered key in this type of task? So that's a good question, and maybe we can unpack that a bit more. And I think I have some slides here. Okay, so we spoke about, this, what was actually asked, and we spoke about, that there wasn't really surprises, except of course the focus on the macro factors. So I want to bring you guys to, this applies to any task, not just a strategy task or a math task, any task. And, my experience from marking the APC for a number of years, that if you can do these things, 3 things well, you will never be an LC, as in never, right? So, and the key is obviously to get competent for every task. That would be great. But I think a first hurdle is to try and avoid the LCs, because it is, in my experience, it's the LCs that come and hurt people. It's very sad, like when you start to see LCs racking up, and then there is some competence shown in later tasks, but then by that time, the LCs have hurt candidates so much. So I really, first point of call is like, I want to be the voice in your head that says, Elton said, avoid LCs at all costs, okay? And obviously that's not it's easier said than done, but these are the 3 questions that I think if you can answer it, tackle them appropriately, you will never be an LC. Okay, so the first question is, what are all the components of the task? So let's take like this task. I think the components, there were 2 components. Like one was a checklist, and why you are saying that should be on the checklist. So that's in a sense 2 components, right? So if you are just giving a checklist without saying why that should be, you are not covering all the components of the task. So which means you will never be a C. Even if your checklist is amazing, you're not telling us why, because the question asks like, give us a checklist and tell us why, right? It's quite clear. Yeah, let me go back to key factors that should be considered, explanation of why each factor is relevant. That's too clear, 2 key things that's needed, right? So if you didn't do that, you won't be a C, okay? Then this is the part that I think we need to focus on. It's like, what are the key issues or the crux of each component? So it's one thing to get to the checklist, that you must do the checklist, one thing to explain, but then you also, within each aspect, you want to get to the key things, okay? And I think here the key things would have been prompted by, firstly, the focus on macro. Like if you focus on macro, you were putting yourself in a good position to start to get to the key things. And then obviously the things that came out of this report would have also helped you to get to the key things. So that's in this specific task. In another task, like Rendani's task that he just covered with you guys, how to get to the crux is take a line for line approach and question the calculation or whatever someone's presenting to you. Like if you do that, you're going to get to the crux of what is being asked on the day. Okay, and then the third thing is you have to address what's asked on the day. So, and this is where the dumping comes in. If you can try to prepare for what's coming, but if you take that, your prepared answer, and you don't adjust it for what's asked on the day, you run a huge risk of dumping. And at the end of the day, you got to answer what's asked on the day. So in summary, I said it's easier said than done, but focus on any task. What are the components? And I must address all the components. Then within each component, I want to get to the key issues, and some of it will be impacted by, what your pre-research, picking up the triggers and all of those things. And some of it also will be impacted by focusing on what's being presented on the day. And then, of course, the third thing is make sure you address what's asked on the day. So if there's a slight change on the day, like I think a few years ago, I can't remember the task. There was a task that, oh, it looked like it was going to be a valuation, and then on the day it was an NPV. I think there was a task. So it looked like it was going to be but on the day it was, so there was a slight change. So students prepared for valuations, but then on the day it was an actual NPV. And if you want to do a valuation, obviously you're going to miss what is being asked. Cool. Does that make sense, guys? Like, if you can do those three things, I know it's easier said than done, but like the minute you start to miss out on one of those three things, then you start to move further away from competence. But if you do those three things, you will never be an LC. Does it make sense? Cool. Bongeka saying, yeah, it's the 6 capitals in Indani spoke about. Yeah, so I mean, it's task specific. I think the 6 capitals are important and good. I think, but in this specific task, I think your starting point to getting to the key was that focus on macro. If you didn't focus on macro, it would have been very difficult to get to the key things. Okay. Sorry, guys. I know Rendani said I shouldn't finish later than 9:30, so won't go longer than 12 more minutes. Okay, so I thought I'd then just remind you guys, like, what do I mean? I think there was a question about what's macro and what's micro. So there's just picture that I tried to explain like just now. So the micro environment is where the organization sits, right? Okay, so Lampros is the organization, and in terms of, and they are affected by the microenvironment, which is suppliers, distributors, competitors. And when you think about the strategic tools, those will be more your Porters, 5 Forsters, bargaining power of suppliers, customers, competition. All of those things are industry related, but that's more micro environment. Okay, but the macro environment is the PESTEL model: political, environmental, forget what the S stands for. T is technological, E is economic, and L is legal. The S social. I think the S is social. So you can see the PESTEL model is more focused on the macro. And when you look at the specific task, the one key tool that would have, I think, been so useful in this task is if you applied the PESTEL model. And so I think if we go back, the earlier question that was asked, like if we go to the pre-release, there was triggers to macro and macro. So sorry, micro and macro. So I think there was triggers to both. And hopefully, you would have prepared for both. And in preparing for both, you would have applied, a bit of SAF, Porters, 5 Forsters, SWOT, and macro. But I think on the day, by far, because of the focus on a country level, it would have been the macro model that would have, and PESTEL is probably the only one that I can think of. There might be other models, but a key model in helping you to focus on macro factors. Okay, so now when we just go into some of the key factors, if you have a look at those are all macro factors. Political, remember the PESTEL model: political, environmental, social, technological, economic, legal. If you look, political stability, corruption, fiscal stability, broad-based infrastructure, exchange rate, regulatory language barriers, state of the public education. That's obviously in this context key. Population size, labor, crime levels, cultural differences, all of those things. Do you guys see how that links to the PESTEL model? Okay, this is not always going to be the case, guys, where one task focused, or let's put it this way, where one, let's call it model or framework, helps you to answer an entire task. It's not always going to be the case. The only reason why it's relevant here is because the task itself asks you to focus on macro, and the one tool that helps you to focus on macro is PESTEL. So I think if you applied PESTEL, you would have been able to come up with a lot of these things, taking into account what came out of those reports. Does that make sense? Any questions on this? Okay, as I said, I will be sharing my slides. Okay, now the last slide is a very dangerous slide because it's my thoughts on competence. I didn't mark this APC, it's just my thoughts. Well, EPC's thoughts on what would have been competence for this task. But we do have some experience in marking, so I think we pretty much wouldn't have been far off from what our cycle would have marked this task. So I want to say it's our thoughts on how a competent candidate would have been assessed for this task. And I think if we start with competence, and I want to show you like a competent grading, let's go back to the 3 factors, right? All components of the task must be addressed, the crux of each component, and, basically, just make sure that you address what changed from the pre-release to on the day, or maybe just say it simply, make sure you answer what's asked on the day. And if I take what I think was a competent candidate is someone that obviously have the 8 factors that you were asked, so that's one aspect, right? And then in that aspect, to get to the, obviously it's 8, so you at least want some coverage, because, coverage is somewhat linked to getting to the crux. And, it's not a mathematical game necessarily, but, well, it's not a mathematical game, but like half of the 8 being valid is probably starting to be more borderline. You probably want to, at least 5 of that must be valid. So if you're going to run this dumping approach of just either that, someone asked about if I listed 10, nothing wrong with listing 10 necessarily, but like a sufficient number of what you are listing must be valid. And my gut is like probably 5 or more of what you listed must be valid. Then, of course, you had to explain the relevance of what you are listing. And then at least some of what you are listing must be arguably key, right? So, and this is important because there's a difference between valid, right? So, for example, like let's go back to the factors. So, exchange rate difference is a valid factor, and you should get credit for it, right? Exchange rate is a valid factor, okay? But it's not necessarily key, right? So to think about worrying about the exchange rate, whether we're going to convert from from the Botswana pula appropriately into South African rand, like that's definitely a valid consideration, for example. But I wouldn't say it's key, right? So for a competent candidate, we would have at least want some of his valid factors to be key factors. And the key factor stems from your pre-research. So, a lot of those reports talk about corruption, fiscal stability, the political risk, the size of the market. So remember, we focus here on education. So in private education, so is there enough of an appetite for private education in those countries, or is there enough of the population that can afford private education? And then exchange controls is just, like there's a lot of controls around. How do I get the money back into South Africa? It's one thing to translate it for my financials, but to actually get the physical money from the banks over there into the banks in South Africa is quite a key risk. Okay. So, but what I want you to see is, do you see how my assessment of competence talks to these 3 things? Thus, it addresses all the components, it gets to the key stuff, and it's focused on what's being asked on the day. You guys see that?
Yes.
Cool. So, and that's going to apply to every task, guys. It's not just the math tasks. Every task, those 3 things is going to apply. So I really want to caution you guys to, on the day, be alert to that you're addressing those three components. Because if you can do that again, I'm going to say it again, I know I've said it a lot, but I really, really, really want you to avoid the LCs. If you can do that, you will never be an LC. Okay, cool. Then just, again, my assessment, but from experience, I highly competent is, and you would have seen this coming through in our tasks. A highly competent candidate is someone that obviously meets what we consider competent and has some high level factors. Just want to emphasize though, it's not because you have high level factors, you'll be highly competent. Now you first have to be competent, in other words, meet the competent profile, and then have high level factors. And then a BC and LC is usually a step down approach from a C profile. So, you know, the key thinking normally goes into what do we consider competent? And then as we move further down from that, that's when we get into BC and LC. And if I take my three-prong approach here, an LC candidate is most likely someone who either only covers one of these three things or none of it. They're probably going to be LC. A BC could be someone who has all three, but they're falling short a little bit somewhere. But if you address all three, as I said, you will never be an LC, and that's the first step, is to avoid the LCs. Cool. I've spoken a lot, but I promise Rendani I won't finish later than 9:30. So we've got 3 minutes left for any questions. I will share my slides. Are there any specific questions? James, yeah, technology would have been key. And just James, how do you explain that? How you explain the relevance of technology would also then play into that. So technology would have been key. Any other questions or comments?
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Inyasha, I can hear you.
I just wanted to ask how you would have explained the points or the factors that you would put on the checklist in a way that it relates to Lampros.
Okay, cool. So that's a good question. So let me go to what's happening with my mouse. Sorry guys, my mouse is not. Okay, while I'm waiting for my mouse to sort itself out. Oh, here it is. Okay, so let me go back to the SASF model. I think what would be helpful is to list those factors and to almost talk about why those factors in light of Lampros, because that's your question, right? So for Lampros, we have to keep in mind what's their strategy. So their strategy or their goal is obviously expanding into Africa, but in terms of their schooling model that they're trying to do, is they're trying to do a combination, like blended learning, right? So so in terms of these factors, like the political stability, right, of the country. So that would have been on your checklist, and you kind of just have to say, well, why would political stability affect the possibility of starting a private education school? So for example, I would have said, and again, guys, I can assure you that in the APC, we are not looking for perfection. We are not looking for you to be an English grammar major student. We just want to see your thinking. So like political stability, for example, I would say, well, if we're in an environment where the political environment is not stable, there might be barriers for us to start a private institution, or there might be political factors which will impact our ability to expand within that country. So there might not be an appetite for private investors to come into the country or something like that because of the political environment. Does that make sense? So I'm just trying to, you pretty much just have to say, well, political stability, why would that be something that Lampros would need to consider? Like exchange rate, I think that's the easy one. Exchange rate, stability or currency risk. Why is that something that they should consider? Well, ultimately, we are making our money ultimately, in rands. And so if, but the amount of money we can make in rands obviously will be subject to exchange rate fluctuations, and we could make less than what we expect. Does that help to answer your question? So
It does. Thank you, Elton.
Pleasure. I almost think for this task, what was more difficult is to come up with the factors, and then the relevance was less of an importance in terms of, but you at least had to say how it's relevant. But like the articulation of the relevance was almost less important if you got to the key factors. But obviously not having the relevance at all would have, that would have marked, taken you down quite significantly. Any other questions? Cool. I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. Sorry we went over time, but I hope you found it useful. I will make sure that the slides gets uploaded for you guys as ASAP. And if I don't see any of you guys again online, all the best for the APC. When in doubt, avoid the LCs completely. So when in doubt, avoid the LCs. Trusting for success for all of you guys. Cheers, everyone. Pleasure. The safe model. Play it safe and avoid the LCs. Cheers, take care.